When a gang of men clad in leather jackets descended on a black farmer's land, they saw nothing more than a solitary figure standing amid sprawling fields, an easy target to be bullied into submission. To them, he was just another man they could intimidate, another life they could uproot to serve their agenda. What they couldn't have known was that beneath his calm demeanor was a retired Marine with a Medal of Honor, a man forged in the crucible of combat and unyielding in his resolve to protect what was his. The fields they sought to claim weren't just dirt and crops. They were the product of years of hard work. Their threats, laced with venom and arrogance, set the stage for a battle that would test not only the farmer's strength, but the unity of a community long accustomed to looking over its shoulder. As their destructive plans escalated, the farmer would be forced to confront them, not just with words, but with action. What began as a calculated display of dominance would spiral into a confrontation that would shake the town to its core. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The setting sun cast a warm glow over Elijah Carter's farm, stretching golden light across the fields of corn and wheat he'd planted himself. The farm was his pride, the culmination of years of planning, hard work, and a desire for peace. After serving 20 years in the Marines and earning the nation's highest military honor, he'd traded the chaos of war for the quiet rhythm of the land. But lately, that peace had begun to fracture. Elijah leaned against the barn, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon as unease prickled at him. The incidents started small, a gate left open, leading to his livestock wandering loose. Then came the flat tires on his tractor, the irrigation system mysteriously tampered with, and just last week, his shed window smashed. He wanted to believe it was coincidence or random mischief, but deep down, he knew better. This was deliberate. His property stood out in the county, not because it was the largest, it wasn't, but because he was one of the few black farmers in the area, and his success hadn't gone unnoticed. He'd overheard enough murmurs in town to know some people didn't like seeing him thrive here. The thought made his jaw tighten. He'd fought harder battles than this, and wasn't about to be intimidated now. As he turned toward the house, the low rumble of an approaching truck broke the stillness of the evening. Elijah's hand instinctively drifted to his pocket, where his folding knife sat. A beat-up pickup rolled to a stop at the edge of his property. The driver lingered, the truck idling noisily as its headlights cut across the gravel driveway. A voice, sharp and mocking, called out, "Carter, you don't belong here. Time to pack it up before someone does it for you." Something small flew from the truck window and landed in the dirt before the vehicle sped off in a cloud of dust. Elijah approached the crumpled note, unfolding it with steady hands. The message was scrawled in rough handwriting, "Sell your farm, or else." Beneath the words was a crude drawing of a burning barn. Elijah's lips pressed into a hard line. These cowards thought they could rattle him, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Turning back to the house, he resolved to prepare for whatever was coming next. Elijah Carter sat at his kitchen table, the crumpled note in front of him. The faint smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, but the warmth of the mug in his hands did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Martha leaned against the counter, her arms folded as she stared at the paper. "They're not even hiding it anymore," she said, her voice low but sharp. "What kind of people threaten a man just for owning land?" Elijah sighed, setting his mug down. "The kind who think they can scare me off," he replied, "but they've got another thing coming." Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes betrayed her concern. She knew Elijah well enough to see the determination hardening in his expression. "I just don't want this getting out of hand," she said softly. "We've got enough to worry about without you playing hero." "This isn't about being a hero," Elijah said, his voice steady. "This is about standing my ground. They think they can intimidate us because of who we are, but I won't give them that satisfaction." The sound of gravel crunching outside made them both pause. Elijah stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved to the window. A sheriff's cruiser had pulled into the driveway, its lights off. A wiry man in his mid-40s stepped out, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat before heading toward the door. Elijah opened it before the man could knock. "Sheriff Grant?" Elijah greeted, his tone neutral. "What brings you out here?" Grant's gaze flicked to the crumpled note on the table behind Elijah. "Heard about some trouble," he said. "Thought I'd check in." "Trouble's one word for it," Elijah replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Had a visitor last night. Left that behind." Grant picked up the note, his brow furrowing as he read it. He let out a low whistle. "This is serious," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Any idea who might have sent it?" "No names, but I've got my suspicions," Elijah said. "You know the kind of folks who don't take kindly to someone like me running a successful farm." Grant shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "Well, I'll file a report, but without any solid evidence, there's not much I can do," he said. "These things have a way of blowing over." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Blowing over? You think this is just going to go away on its own?" "I'm saying you might want to keep your head down," Grant said, his tone cautious. "Don't go stirring up trouble." Elijah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cold, controlled tone. "I didn't fight for this country just to come home and be told to keep my head down. I've dealt with worse than cowards who hide behind threats." Grant raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I get it, Carter. I do. But this town's complicated. People don't like change, and you've got folks riled up just by being here." "Riled up?" Martha interjected, her voice cutting through the room. "Owning land and working it isn't riling people up. It's existing. And if that's enough to make them mad, then that's their problem." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he placed the note back on the table. "I'll see what I can do," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Just be careful." Elijah watched as the sheriff left, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. He turned to Martha, who shook her head. "He's not going to help us," she said. "Not really?" "No," Elijah agreed. "But that doesn't mean we're on our own." The next morning, Elijah walked the perimeter of his farm, taking stock of the damage from the past few weeks. The broken irrigation lines, the flattened crops, it all added up to one message. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they pushed him off his land. By the time he reached the edge of the property, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the soft dirt. They weren't his. He knelt, running his fingers over the grooves, his mind already piecing together what it meant. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. "Elijah!" Martha's voice carried across the field, sharp with urgency. He stood, his gaze snapping toward the house. She waved him over, holding a small package in her hands. His stomach sank as he approached. "It was on the porch," she said, handing it to him. The box was plain and unmarked, sealed with thick tape. Elijah's hands tensed as he opened it, revealing a single charred piece of wood, part of a fence post, with a burnt word scrawled across it. "Leave." Elijah's eyes narrowed as he stared at the message. "They're trying to break me," he said, his voice low. "But they're about to find out just how wrong they are." He turned back toward the house, his mind already racing with plans. It was time to prepare for the next move, because he knew they'd be back. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over Elijah Carter's farm. He stood by his tractor, wiping sweat from his brow after another long day of work. The rhythmic hum of crickets filled the air, but a faint growl of engines broke the peace. Elijah turned, narrowing his eyes at the sight of 3 trucks kicking up dust as they approached. The vehicles stopped at the edge of his property, lined up like a blockade. 5 men climbed out, each wearing battered leather jackets, their bald heads gleaming in the fading sunlight. They moved with deliberate swagger, spreading out as if to claim the space. The leader, a wiry man with a red bandana tied around his neck, stepped forward with a smug smirk. "Evening, Carter," the man called, his tone mocking. "Nice little place you got here." Elijah stepped forward, calm but unflinching. "What do you want?" The man motioned lazily to the fields behind Elijah. "Oh, we just wanted to come by, check out the view, see how much longer you plan on sticking around where you're not wanted." "This is my land," Elijah said firmly. "Bought and paid for." If you've got something to say it. The man chuckled, glancing back at his crew. All right, I'll spell it out for you. You've got 1 week to pack it up and sell this farm. 1 week. If you're still here after that, things are gonna get unpleasant. Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I'm not selling. The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. You don't get it, do you? This land, it was never meant for someone like you. This town's not for you, Carter. Never was. One of the men, a thick-set brute with a jagged scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt. Yeah, you walk around like you belong here, like you're better than us. But you're not. You're just another uppity. Enough! Elijah's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the man's words. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on the leader. You can talk all you want, but it won't change the facts. I worked for this land. I built it, and I'm not going anywhere. The leader let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Worked for it? You think that makes you special? You're just a black man who got lucky. This land was never meant for you. It should have gone to someone who knows what to do with it, someone who belongs here. Elijah's fists tightened at his sides, but his voice stayed cold and even. What you're really mad about is seeing someone like me succeed. That's your problem, not mine. You're damn right it's a problem. Another man growled, stepping forward. His leather jacket creaked as he crossed his arms, his glare full of contempt. People like you come in, thinking you can take over, think you can live like us, act like us. But you don't belong. Elijah's eyes flicked to the man, then back to the leader. Belong? He said, his voice hard. I belong anywhere I choose to be. I fought for this country, earned my place the hard way, and I'm not about to let a group of thugs tell me otherwise. The leader's smirk twisted into a scowl, and he took another step closer. You think your medals mean something here? Out here, you're nothing but a target. And if you don't sell, you and that little family of yours might find out just how dangerous it can get. At that, Elijah's expression shifted, his calm resolve replaced by a flicker of anger. You come near my family and you'll regret it. The leader tilted his head, a mocking grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Oh, we're not here to hurt anyone. Yet. But accidents happen. Barns catch fire. Fields get trampled. Livestock wander off. You'd hate to see that happen, wouldn't you? The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in false courtesy. Elijah's heart pounded. But he stood his ground. You're wasting your time, he said coldly. If you're looking for someone to scare, you came to the wrong place. The leader stepped back slightly but didn't leave. Instead, he turned to his men, as if to gauge their mood. You hear that, boys? Carter here thinks he's untouchable. Thinks he can stand up to us. One of the men sneered. Let's see how tough he is when this place is nothing but ashes. Elijah's fists curled so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, but he didn't move. He kept his voice calm, the sharp edge of steel behind his words. You've said your piece. Now you're trespassing. Get off my land. The leader didn't move, his grin widening. Or what? You gonna call the sheriff? We all know he's not going to help you. Elijah didn't answer, his silence more intimidating than anything he could have said. For a moment, the standoff stretched into a tense silence, the gang testing his resolve, their laughter dying out as they realized Elijah wasn't backing down. The air between Elijah and the gang felt thick, like the calm before a storm. The leader stood his ground, his smirk unwavering, his crew shifting restlessly behind him. Elijah studied their faces, scarred, sneering, and full of malice. These weren't just locals blowing off steam. There was something deliberate, organized, about the way they moved and spoke. You've said your piece, Elijah said, his voice cold and even, but I've got one question before you go. Who are you? The leader raised an eyebrow, then let out a low chuckle. You don't know. He glanced back at his men, who exchanged knowing smirks. We're just concerned citizens, Carter. Folks who don't like seeing things change too much around here. Concerned about what? Elijah pressed, his gaze sharp. A man working his own land? A family trying to make an honest living? The leader tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Call it what you want, but people around here don't like outsiders, especially ones who don't know their place." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Outsider," he repeated. "That's what this is about? I've lived here for years, paid my taxes, helped out in town when I could. That's more than I can say for most people." The scarred man behind the leader scoffed. "Doesn't matter how long you've been here. This town's got a way of doing things, and you don't fit." The leader chuckled again, but his tone grew darker. "You're asking the wrong questions, Carter. It doesn't matter who we are. What matters is that we've got a job to do. And right now, that job is making sure you understand what's at stake." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "What's at stake is my family and my farm. And if you think I'm going to hand them over because a few men in leather jackets decided to show up, you don't know me." The leader's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "We know enough. You're just another guy who thinks he's special because he's got a few medals on the wall. But out here, none of that matters. Out here, you're alone." Elijah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a steely tone. "I'm not alone. And I've faced men tougher than you, so if you're planning on making good on those threats, you'd better be ready for the fight of your life." For a moment, the leader didn't speak. His men shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Elijah's words settling over them. But then he grinned, the humorless expression of a man who thrived on intimidation. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said. "But guts don't mean much when your barn's up in flames or your kids are crying because they don't feel safe anymore." The scarred man laughed, stepping forward. "Yeah, you might be tough, Carter. But your family? They're not. You really want them to pay the price for your pride?" Elijah's fists curled at his sides, but his voice stayed calm. "You think you can scare me by threatening my family? You'd better think again." The leader leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We're giving you 1 week. That's more than fair. But if you're still here after that, don't expect us to play nice." Elijah didn't flinch. "You're wasting your time. This farm isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." The leader straightened, his grin fading. "Have it your way," he said, stepping back toward his truck. "But don't say we didn't warn you." As the men began to retreat, one of them turned, a malicious gleam in his eye. "You think you're tough now, Carter. Let's see how tough you are when you're standing in a pile of ashes." The trucks roared to life, their engines drowning out the fading light of day. Dust kicked up as the vehicles peeled out, leaving Elijah standing alone in the quiet aftermath. He exhaled slowly, his fists still clenched, as he watched them disappear down the road. Back inside the house, Elijah recounted the encounter to Martha. Her face paled as he repeated the gang's words, her hands trembling as she gripped the back of a chair. "They threatened the kids?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "They think they can scare us off," Elijah said, his tone low but firm, "but they've got another thing coming." Martha shook her head, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "Elijah, this isn't just talk. They'll come back." "You know they will." "I know," Elijah said, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. "That's why we need to be ready." The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields as Elijah Carter walked the perimeter of his farm. His boots crunched against the dirt, the weight of the gang's threats lingering in his mind like a storm cloud. Every broken irrigation pipe, every scarred patch of earth felt like a message, a declaration that the battle for his land had already begun. Elijah stopped at the barn, running his hand over the smooth, freshly painted wall. The memory of the hateful slur that had been scrawled there weeks ago still burned in his mind, though the paint had long since covered it. These men weren't just trying to scare him. They wanted him gone, erased from the land he had built with his own hands. He reached the edge of the field, where the fresh tire tracks from the gang's trucks were still visible in the dirt. He crouched, running his fingers over the grooves, his sharp eyes studying the pattern. They hadn't bothered to hide their presence. They wanted him to know they were watching. As he stood, Martha's voice called out from the house, "Elijah! Breakfast is ready." He nodded, and made his way back, his mind already racing with plans. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and fried eggs filled the air, but Martha's usual warmth was missing. She stood at the counter, her arms crossed, her face drawn with worry. "They'll come back," she said, breaking the silence as Elijah poured himself a cup of coffee. "You know they will." Elijah set the mug down, his gaze steady. "I know. So, what are we going to do?" Martha pressed, her voice trembling. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to show up again." Elijah leaned against the counter, his expression calm but resolute. "We're not going to sit here. But we're not running either." Martha's eyes filled with frustration. "Elijah, this isn't like the military. We don't have backup or reinforcements. It's just us." Elijah met her gaze, his voice firm. "I know what I'm doing, Martha. I've faced worse than this. These men think they can bully us because they've never met anyone who will stand up to them. That's their mistake." Martha shook her head, her voice rising. "But what about the kids? What if they won't," Elijah interrupted, his voice steady but cold. "I won't let them." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Martha's shoulders sagged. She looked down at the floor, her hands trembling. I don't want to lose this, Elijah. This farm, this life. We've worked so hard for it." Elijah stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not going to lose it," he said softly. "I promise you that." Later that day, Elijah drove into town, his truck rumbling down the narrow streets. The town square was quiet, the usual hum of activity subdued. As he parked near the hardware store, a few locals cast glances his way. Some curious, others wary. He ignored them, his focus on gathering what he needed. Inside the store, Elijah loaded his cart with nails, wood planks, and other supplies. As he reached for a roll of barbed wire, the clerk behind the counter cleared his throat. "Building something." Elijah glanced at the man, a middle-aged figure with a skeptical look. "Just some repairs," he replied. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Heard you've been having some trouble out there." Elijah paused, meeting the man's gaze. "Word travels fast." The clerk shrugged. "Small town, people talk. You sure it's a good idea, staying out there? Some folks don't like change." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not running from it either." The clerk nodded slowly, though his expression remained doubtful. "Well, good luck to you." Back at the farm, Elijah spent the afternoon reinforcing the property. He repaired weak spots in the fence, fortified the barn doors, and strung the barbed wire along vulnerable areas. Sweat poured down his face as he worked, the physical labor grounding him, giving him a sense of control in the face of uncertainty. As the sun began to set, he stood back, surveying his work. The farm wasn't a fortress, but it was ready, and so was he. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Martha, the kids already asleep inside, the quiet of the night felt heavier than usual. Martha leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you really think we can stop them?" Elijah's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the fields stretched endlessly into the dark. "We don't have a choice," he said. "This is our home, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect it." The next day, the streets of town bustled with quiet activity as Elijah parked his truck near the grocery store. He stepped out, his boots scuffing against the pavement, and scanned the area. The familiarity of the place was both a comfort and a reminder of how unwelcome he had always been to some. He wasn't here for pleasantries. There were supplies he still needed, and his mind was focused on preparing for whatever came next. As he walked toward the store, a low chuckle cut through the air, stopping him in his tracks. "Well, if it isn't Carter," a mocking voice called out. Elijah turned slowly, his eyes landing on the same gang from his farm, now leaning against the side of a truck parked across the street. The leader, his red bandana hanging loose around his neck, smirked as he pushed off the vehicle and sauntered toward Elijah. "Clock's ticking," the leader said, his voice carrying just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "5 days left, Carter. You making any progress on that packing?" Elijah stood tall, his expression unreadable. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied calmly. though his tone carried a weight that cut through the gang's smug demeanor. The leader's grin widened. "Oh, I think you will. You just haven't figured it out yet." The men behind him laughed, their voices low and taunting. Elijah's eyes flicked to the bystanders, a mix of locals pretending not to notice and a few glances of silent support. But what caught his attention most was a middle-aged black man standing a few feet away, frozen in place as he watched the exchange. One of the gang members, a thick-set man with a scar running along his cheek, noticed the man as well. He sneered, turning his attention to him. "What are you staring at, old man? Got a problem?" The man, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and carrying a small bag of groceries, flinched but didn't reply. The gang member stepped closer, towering over him. "Maybe we need to remind you too. This ain't your town. Leave him alone," Elijah said sharply, his voice cutting through the air. The leader turned back to Elijah, chuckling. "What's the matter, Carter? You think you're the only one we've been checking in on?" He gestured lazily toward the man. "You're not special. There's plenty of folks around here who don't know their place." The gang's laughter echoed through the street, but Elijah's mind was already racing. He turned to the man as the gang sauntered off, their threats lingering like a bad smell. "You all right?" Elijah asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was shaky. "They've been around a lot lately." Elijah frowned. "You too?" The man glanced around, as if checking to make sure the gang was really gone. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "Me and a few others. They've been showing up at people's homes. Threats, vandalism, you name it." Elijah's stomach tightened. He had suspected he wasn't the only one, but hearing it confirmed lit a spark of anger deep within him. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" he asked. "What good would it do?" the man replied bitterly. "The sheriff's not going to help us, and most folks around here don't care." Elijah nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we just sit back and take it." The man studied Elijah for a moment, then gave a reluctant nod. "What do you have in mind?" That evening, Elijah hosted a quiet meeting at his farm. The sun was dipping below the horizon as a handful of black families gathered around his kitchen table. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Some faces were familiar, neighbors and locals Elijah had known for years, but others were strangers, united now by a shared fear. "They've been going after all of us," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm, "one by one, threatening us, trying to scare us off. But we're stronger together than we are alone." "Stronger?" an older woman scoffed. "What do you suggest, Carter? We fight them? We've got kids to think about, families?" Elijah nodded. "I understand. But sitting back and hoping they stop won't work. They're not going to stop unless we make them." "What can we even do?" another man asked. "They've got numbers. They've got the sheriff on their side." Elijah leaned forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've faced men like them before. Bullies who think they can take what they want because no one stands up to them. We don't have to fight them head-on, but we can protect what's ours, fortify our homes, look out for each other, share information. They're organized, but so can we." The room fell quiet, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. Slowly, heads began to nod. "You're right," the first man said, his voice steady now. "We've put up with this long enough. It's time we stood together." "Damn right," another chimed in. By the end of the meeting, a plan was taking shape. The families agreed to keep watch over each other, to share resources and stay in constant communication. Elijah offered to use his farm as a safe gathering point, a place where they could regroup if things escalated. As the families filed out into the night, Elijah stood on the porch, watching the taillights disappear down the road. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The gang might think they had the upper hand, but they had underestimated the strength of a community determined to stand its ground. The morning sun cast long shadows over Elijah Carter's farm as he worked with quiet determination, hammering boards into place along the fence. Each strike of the hammer seemed to echo the gang's threats in his mind, a grim reminder of the danger that loomed. His phone, tucked into his back pocket, suddenly buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. He wiped his hands on his jeans and answered. "Elijah!" James Harris's voice was frantic, panicked. "They're here! The gang! They're tearing my place apart!" Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "What are they doing?" "Everything. They've got bats, chains. They're smashing windows, breaking the fence." James's words came in bursts, his breathing labored. "My wife's crying, and I can't stop them. I don't know what to do." Elijah felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "Lock the doors, keep your wife safe, and don't go outside. I'm on my way." He hung up, his movements swift and precise as he threw his toolbox into the back of his truck. His mind raced as he climbed into the driver's seat, adrenaline coursing through him. As the engine roared to life, he gripped the wheel tightly and sped out of the driveway. The narrow country roads blurred past him, each turn a countdown to what awaited him at James's property. The Harris property came into view, and Elijah's chest tightened at the sight of chaos. The gang was everywhere. Their trucks were parked in the yard, engines idling like sentinels. 4 men moved across the property with deliberate malice, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight. One of them swung a bat at a wooden fence, splinters flying with each strike, while another hurled a planter across the porch, shattering it against the wall. Broken glass and debris littered the ground. The leader, his red bandana loose around his neck, stood with his arms crossed near the front door, barking orders like a general commanding his troops. "Tear it down! Let 'em know we don't want 'em here!" Elijah parked just outside the gate, stepping out of his truck with slow, deliberate movements. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the destruction. His hand drifted to his toolbox in the truck bed, pulling out a crowbar. He wasn't just angry, he was ready to fight. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel drew the gang's attention. The leader turned, his smug grin spreading as he motioned for his men to stop. "Well, look who showed up. Carter, you're just in time to see what happens when people don't take us seriously." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on the leader. "You've made your point. Now get the hell off this property." The leader chuckled, his men laughing along with him. "Point? Oh, we're just getting started. You see, Carter, this isn't just about one family. This is about all of you thinking you can stick around where you're not wanted." One of the men, the burly figure with the chain wrapped around his fist, sneered. "You think showing up here changes anything? You're outnumbered, Carter. Walk away while you still can." Elijah's grip tightened on the crowbar, his voice sharp. "Outnumbered or not, you've got 2 choices. Leave now, or I'll make you leave." The leader's smirk twisted into a sneer as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "You think you can take us all on? You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't protect your friends or your family." Elijah's stomach tightened, his mind racing. "What the hell are you talking about?" The leader motioned lazily toward the property. "You think this is just about Harris? Nah, Carter. We've got eyes on all of you. You might fight us here, but while you're busy playing hero, what happens to the others? What happens to your wife while you're over here swinging that crowbar?" The words hit like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, Elijah froze. He thought of Martha, of the other families who had come to his farm the night before. The gang wasn't bluffing. They were organized, relentless, and they had the numbers to back their threats. "You're cowards," Elijah said, his voice low and cold. "Going after families, threatening women. What does that prove? That you're scared of a fair fight?" The leader laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Fair fight? Carter, this isn't a fight. This is us reminding you who's in charge." For a moment, the tension crackled in the air like static. Elijah's muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to fight, to swing the crowbar and drive them off. But the gang's numbers, their threats, were too calculated. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone. The leader leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got 5 days, Carter. If you're smart, you'll pack up and get out while you still can." The air around the Harris property felt suffocating, heavy with tension and fear. Elijah Carter stood still, gripping the crowbar tightly in his hand as the gang loitered, their malicious grins cutting through the quiet. James Harris remained hidden inside, his face pale behind the curtains. Elijah's mind raced, torn between the instinct to fight and the realization that the gang wasn't bluffing about the scope of their threats. The leader, his red bandana now tied snugly around his neck, tilted his head as he sauntered closer to Elijah. The smirk on his face deepened with every step, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn ground. He stopped just inches from Elijah, his voice dropping to a low, mocking drawl. "Look at you, Carter. All fired up like you're gonna do something." Elijah held his ground, his eyes locked on the man. "I told you to leave." The leader chuckled, leaning in closer until his face was level with Elijah's. "Leave? Oh, we'll leave when we're good and ready. But first, I want you to hear me loud and clear." Elijah didn't flinch, though his grip on the crowbar tightened, his knuckles white. The leader's grin widened as he leaned in even further, his breath hot with malice. "There's nothing you can do. You hear me? Nothing. You can't save him," he said, motioning toward the house. "And if you ever think about coming around to save anyone else, well," he trailed off, the threat hanging in the air like poison. "Let's just say we'll do more than smash up a few fences next time." One of the other men, the scarred brute with the chain wrapped around his fist, stepped up beside the leader, his sneer just as cruel. "You think you're tough, Carter? Playing hero? Try it again, and we'll see how tough you really are." Elijah's chest burned with rage, his teeth clenched so tightly it hurt. His instincts screamed at him to swing, to fight back, to prove that their threats didn't scare him. But as he glanced at the destruction around him, the shattered windows, the broken fences, and thought of the other families, of Martha, he knew he couldn't risk it. Not yet. The leader must have seen the conflict in Elijah's eyes, because his grin grew even more smug. He took a deliberate step back, spreading his arms as if to declare victory. "That's what I thought," he said, loud enough for his men to hear. "You're all the same. All bark, no bite." The gang burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the yard like a cruel chorus. They turned, climbing into their trucks with exaggerated slowness, their movements dripping with mockery. The leader paused before getting into the driver's seat, his gaze flicking back to Elijah, one last time. 5 days, Carter. Remember that." With a roar of engines, the trucks peeled out, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the wreckage of the Harris property. Their laughter faded as they disappeared down the road, but the weight of their presence lingered. As the dust settled, Elijah exhaled slowly, his body still coiled with tension. He turned toward the house, where James and his wife had cautiously stepped onto the porch. James's face was pale, his hands trembling as he surveyed the damage. "Elijah!" James's voice was shaky, his words barely audible. "What are we going to do?" "They're not going to stop." Elijah looked at him, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to break us, but they're not going to win." James shook his head, his voice rising with desperation. "You saw what they did. You heard what they said. They'll come after all of us, Elijah. They won't," Elijah said firmly, cutting him off. "Not if we stick together. Not if we're ready." James fell silent, though his expression remained doubtful. Elijah's gaze swept over the wreckage again, the anger in his chest simmering into resolve. The gang might have had the upper hand today, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We'll rebuild," Elijah said, more to himself than anyone else. "And next time, they won't catch us off guard." The air around the Harris property hung heavy with the aftermath of the gang's departure. The wreckage left behind, shattered windows, splintered fences, and crushed flower beds, spoke volumes about their intent. Elijah stood in the yard, his arms crossed, his mind racing. The gang's words still rang in his ears, a sinister reminder of their next move. James Harris approached cautiously, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Elijah," he began, his voice unsteady, "they're going to come back, aren't they? Not just here, but everywhere. Elijah turned to him, his gaze sharp but steady. "Yes," he said simply, "they will." James's shoulders sagged, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. "I don't know if we can handle this. They've got numbers, they've got weapons, we're just farmers." Elijah shook his head. "We're not just anything. They're trying to scare us into thinking we're weak, but we're stronger together than they realize." James's eyes darted to the damage around him. "What do we do? Wait for them to pick us off one by one?" "No," Elijah said firmly. "We're not waiting. We're changing the plan." James frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. "They want to fight? Then we fight. But we do it on our terms. We're going to bring everyone to my farm. Every family they've threatened. Every person who's willing to stand with us. If they want to come for me, they're going to find all of us waiting." James blinked, stunned. "You're talking about a trap." Elijah nodded. "Exactly. They think they've got the upper hand because they're organized. But so can we. We'll fortify the farm, set up defenses, and when they come, we'll be ready." "But," James hesitated, "what if it's not enough? What if they bring more men?" Elijah's gaze hardened. "Then we fight harder. This isn't just about one farm, James. It's about all of us. If we let them win here, they'll keep going until we're all gone." James exhaled shakily, the weight of Elijah's words settling on him. After a moment, he nodded. "Okay, I'll call the others. We'll be there." That evening, Elijah stood in his kitchen, the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through the window. The room was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the clock, but his mind buzzed with activity. Plans, strategies, and contingencies swirled in his thoughts as he prepared for what was to come. Martha entered the room, her arms crossed. "James called," she said. "He told me what you're planning." Elijah glanced at her, his expression calm but resolute. "It's the only way." Martha's brow furrowed. "You're putting everyone in one place. What if they bring more men? What if someone gets hurt? Or worse?" Elijah set down the blueprint he'd been sketching, a rough map of his farm with key points marked for defense. "If we don't stand together now, they'll pick us off one by one. This is our best chance." Martha leaned against the counter, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm scared, Elijah." "I know," he said, stepping closer and placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "I am too, but we can't let fear stop us. They're counting on us to give up, to back down. If we do that, they win." Martha nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "What do you need me to do?" Elijah gave her a small, grateful smile. "Help me prepare the house. If it comes to it, we'll need a safe space for the kids and anyone else who can't fight." By nightfall, families began arriving at the farm. Trucks and cars pulled into the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness. Men, women, and even teenagers stepped out, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Some carried tools, hammers, shovels, even pitchforks, while others brought supplies, food, water, and first aid kits. Elijah stood on the porch, watching as his neighbors filed in. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the weight of what they were about to face. But he also saw something else: resolve. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "I know you're scared. I am too. But this is our home, and we're not going to let anyone take it from us." One of the men, a burly farmer named Henry, stepped forward. "What's the plan, Elijah?" Elijah motioned to the map spread out on the porch railing. "We're going to fortify the property, build barricades, reinforce the fences, and set up watch points. When they come, we'll be ready." "What about weapons?" a younger man asked. "They've got bats and chains. What do we have?" Elijah's gaze swept over the group. "We have each other. We use what we've got. Tools, farm equipment, anything that can be used to protect ourselves. And we use our wits. This isn't about meeting them blow for blow. It's about outsmarting them." The group nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Slowly, the tension began to shift. Fear gave way to purpose, and uncertainty turned into determination. Elijah looked out over his community, his jaw set. This is our land, our homes, and we're going to fight for them. The first light of dawn broke over Elijah Carter's farm, bathing the fields in soft gold. But there was no time to appreciate the calm beauty of the morning. The air buzzed with activity as men and women worked together, fortifying the property. The usual sounds of farm life were replaced by the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the scrape of shovels against dirt, and the occasional murmur of quiet conversation. Elijah stood in the center of the yard, overseeing the preparations. His sharp eyes tracked every movement, ensuring nothing was overlooked. The families who had gathered the night before were spread out across the property, working with quiet determination. "Reinforce the barn doors," Elijah called out to a group of men carrying heavy wooden planks. "If they try to break in, make it as hard as possible for them." Henry, the burly farmer who had stepped forward the night before, nodded and gestured to the others. "You heard him. Let's get this done." Elijah turned to another group, this one made up of teenagers and younger adults. They were digging trenches along the perimeter, their hands blistered, but their resolve unshaken. "Keep those trenches narrow but deep," Elijah instructed. "They'll slow down anyone trying to rush the fences." Nearby, Martha and a few other women were organizing supplies. They had set up a makeshift command center on the porch, with stacks of water bottles, food, and first aid kits. Martha's hands moved deftly as she sorted through the items, but her face was drawn, her worry evident in the tight line of her mouth. "Elijah!" she called out, motioning him over. "We've got enough supplies to last for a few days if it comes to that. But the first aid kit is looking thin." Elijah nodded, his gaze flicking to the horizon. "We'll make do with what we've got. Hopefully, this won't last long." Martha placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Elijah met her eyes, his expression softening for a brief moment. "I promise." By mid-morning, the farm was beginning to look more like a fortress. The fences had been reinforced with barbed wire and extra planks, while the barn and house had been fortified with heavy wooden beams. Strategically placed piles of hay bales served as cover, and the trenches around the perimeter were nearly complete. James Harris approached Elijah, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's coming together," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of exhaustion and hope. "But do you really think this will be enough?" Elijah glanced around, taking in the sight of his neighbors working side by side. "It has to be," he replied. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait." James hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. At least we're not sitting ducks anymore." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the mood on the farm shifted. The initial flurry of activity gave way to an uneasy stillness as the preparations neared completion. The families gathered in small groups, sharing quiet conversations and casting wary glances at the road leading to the property. The tension was palpable, the weight of what was coming pressing down on everyone. Elijah stood on the porch, scanning the horizon. His crowbar leaned against the railing, a silent reminder of what was at stake. Henry joined him, carrying a shovel over one shoulder. "You think they'll come tonight?" Henry asked, his voice low. Elijah didn't look away from the road. "If not tonight, then soon. They're not the type to wait long." Henry nodded grimly. "Well, we'll be ready." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah called everyone together. The group gathered in the yard, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns. The air was heavy with anticipation, but also with a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. Elijah stepped forward, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "You've all done an incredible job today. Look around you. This is what they're afraid of. Not the fences or the trenches, but us standing together." The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the group. Elijah continued, his tone firm. "They'll come thinking they can intimidate us, that they can break us. But we're not going to let that happen. This is our home, our land, and we're going to show them what happens when they try to take it from us." The group broke into applause, a small but powerful show of determination. Elijah stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He felt the weight of their trust, their hope, and their fear, and he knew he couldn't let them down. As the families settled in for the night, taking shifts to keep watch, Elijah stood on the porch, his crowbar in hand. The stars above seemed brighter than usual, their light stark against the darkness of the night. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The trap was set. Now, all they could do was wait. The stillness of the early dawn was broken by the low growl of engines rumbling down the dirt road leading to Elijah Carter's farm. The sound carried across the fields, waking those who had fallen into uneasy sleep and jolting those on watch into high alert. From the porch, Elijah narrowed his eyes as headlights cut through the pre-dawn mist, the unmistakable roar of multiple trucks sending a chill through the air. "They're here," one of the men whispered, his voice tense. Elijah gripped his crowbar tightly, his gaze steady. He'd expected them, but not this soon. The gang was early, too early, and there were more of them than before. 5 trucks pulled up in a loose formation, their engines roaring as they skidded to a stop. Doors slammed, and nearly a dozen men climbed out, their leather jackets gleaming in the faint light. From the lead truck, the familiar figure of the gang's leader emerged, his red bandana tied tightly around his neck. He glanced around the farm, his expression darkening. "Where are the others, Carter?" he called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "Thought you'd have your little community here to back you up." Elijah stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved to meet the gang halfway. "They're not your concern," he said, his voice steady. "You've already done enough damage. Turn around and leave." The leader laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Turn around? After coming all this way?" "Nah, Carter, we're just getting started." He motioned to the men behind him, who fanned out, some carrying bats, others chains, and one with a crowbar slung over his shoulder. "Figured you'd get brave and try to pull something, so we brought a few extra friends to make sure you understand how things work around here." Elijah's jaw tightened, his grip on his own crowbar firm. "This is my farm, my land, and I'm not going anywhere." The leader's smirk widened. "You really think you can stand against us? You're just one man, Carter. And you can't fight all of us." "I don't need to fight all of you," Elijah said coldly. "But if you think I'll let you take this land without a fight, you're dead wrong." The leader's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. "Tough talk. Let's see if you can back it up." The gang began to advance, their boots crunching against the gravel as they spread out across the yard. Elijah stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. From behind the barn and the surrounding shadows, faint movements hinted at the families hiding in wait, ready to spring into action. The plan was set, and the trap was ready to be sprung. "You think you're clever, Carter?" The leader spat, stepping closer until he was inches from Elijah's face. "Trying to get everyone to band together like you're some kind of hero? You're not a hero. You're just a stubborn old man who doesn't know when to quit." Elijah didn't flinch. Better to be stubborn than a coward who hides behind a gang. The leader's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching as though itching to strike. "Careful, Carter. You might just regret those words." The tension snapped like a bowstring as one of the gang members, a hulking figure with a bat, lunged toward Elijah. Instinct took over. Elijah sidestepped the attack, swinging his crowbar in a sharp arc that collided with the man's shoulder. The crack of impact echoed through the yard, followed by the man's pained grunt as he stumbled back. The fight had begun. Chaos erupted as the rest of the gang surged forward. Elijah ducked and weaved, his years of military training guiding his movements. He swung his crowbar with precision, forcing the attackers to back off, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. Shouts and the clang of metal on metal filled the air, the once quiet farm now a battlefield. Then, from the shadows, the families made their move. Henry and a group of men charged out from behind the barn, wielding shovels, hammers, and even pitchforks. Others emerged from the trenches, their tools raised as makeshift weapons. The gang, caught off guard by the sudden reinforcements, stumbled back in confusion. "Now!" Elijah shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The families pressed their advantage, using the barricades and trenches to their benefit. The gang's confidence faltered as they realized they were outmaneuvered. The leader's smirk disappeared, replaced by a snarl. "You think this changes anything, Carter? We'll burn this place to the ground." "Not today," Elijah shot back, swinging his crowbar to disarm another attacker. "You underestimated us. That's your mistake." The fight raged on, each side locked in a desperate struggle. But with every passing minute, it became clear that the gang was losing their grip. The families, driven by the need to protect their homes and each other, fought with a ferocity that the gang hadn't expected. The gang surged forward, their numbers seeming to grow in the early morning light as they charged toward the barricades. Elijah Carter stood at the forefront, his crowbar gleaming in his grip, muscles taut as the chaos erupted around him. The air filled with the sound of shouts, the clatter of metal, and the crunch of gravel beneath hurried feet. A gang member lunged at Elijah, swinging a bat with wild intent. Elijah ducked, the bat slicing through the air above him. He pivoted on his heel, driving the end of the crowbar into the man's ribs with a dull thud. The attacker stumbled back, gasping, but Elijah didn't let up. He swung again, the metal connecting with the man's arm, sending him sprawling to the ground. Around him, the community fought with a ferocity born of desperation and determination. Henry, armed with a shovel, blocked the advance of two attackers trying to breach the fence. He swung with a grunt, catching one in the side and forcing him to retreat. A group of teenagers lobbed rocks and clumps of dirt from behind hay bales, their projectiles striking gang members with surprising accuracy. Elijah's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep them at the barricades. Don't let them get inside." A sudden commotion near the barn drew Elijah's attention. Two gang members had managed to flank the defenses, slipping past the trenches and heading straight for the main structure. Elijah's heart pounded as he sprinted toward them, his boots kicking up dust. He caught up to the first man just as he reached the barn doors, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and yanking him backward. The man snarled, twisting to throw a punch, but Elijah blocked it with his forearm. He countered with a sharp jab to the man's stomach, doubling him over, then followed up with an elbow to the side of his head. The second man charged, swinging a chain, but Elijah ducked under the attack and swept the man's legs out from under him. Both attackers were down, groaning in the dirt. Meanwhile, the gang's leader stood near their trucks, barking orders. "Push harder! They're just a bunch of farmers! Break their lines!" The gang rallied, surging forward with renewed aggression. The community, though outnumbered, held their ground. Women and older teens armed with slingshots and makeshift weapons rained down projectiles from behind cover, forcing the gang to slow their advance. Henry shouted from his position at the barricades. "They're trying to come through the east fence. We need backup." Elijah turned, his breath heavy, and motioned to a group of men nearby. "Go with Henry. Hold that fence." The men nodded and sprinted toward the eastern side of the property, their tools raised like weapons. Elijah took a deep breath, scanning the battlefield. The gang's numbers were formidable, but the community's determination was holding them back. For now, the tide of the battle began to shift as the gang adjusted their strategy. They started using their weapons more ruthlessly, swinging bats and chains with brutal force. One gang member managed to climb over the barricade, only to be met by a sharp blow from a rake wielded by an elderly farmer. Another attacker slipped through the trenches, but was stopped by a well-aimed rock to the temple, thrown by a teenage girl with fierce precision. Despite these victories, the community was beginning to tire. Their movements grew slower, their strikes less forceful. Elijah could see it, the cracks forming in their defense, the fatigue setting in. The gang's leader noticed too, his grin widening as he stepped forward. "Carter!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "You really think this is going to work? Look at them. They're breaking. Just give up now and save yourself the trouble." Elijah's jaw tightened, his grip on the crowbar firm. "Not a chance," he called back, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The leader's grin twisted into a sneer. "Fine. Have it your way. Boys, Time to turn up the heat. The gang's renewed push was brutal. They broke through the barricades in several places, forcing the defenders to fall back toward the center of the property. Elijah fought with everything he had, his crowbar a blur as he blocked and countered attacks. His muscles burned, but he refused to let up. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Don't let them take another step." A gang member swung a chain at Elijah, the metal whistling through the air. Elijah sidestepped, grabbing the chain and yanking it out of the man's hands. He swung the crowbar in a wide arc, catching the attacker in